On December 20th, 2002, a well-behaved and dedicated teenager arrived at his shift at work and was never seen again. The investigation led to a close-knit community pointing fingers at one another. Detectives uncovered many secrets, including drug dealing, owed money, and a bloody produce cooler. More than 2 decades later, and the case is still unsolved. Welcome to Without a Trace. I'm your host, Jalen. Every file holds a mystery. Every story deserves to be heard. This is Brian's story. Brian Carrick was born on September 13, 1985, to Bill and Terry Carrick. He was the 11th of 14 children in the home. He was a junior at Johnsburg High School and was described as a well-behaved teenager. Brian, along with 7 of his siblings, worked at Val's Foods, a local grocery store down the road from the Carrick's home. Val's Foods was owned by Jerry Casiero. The Casiero and Carrick families were friendly for nearly 20 years, as more than half of the Carrick children worked at Val's at some point. Brian was an exemplary employee. If he noticed the line at Val's was backed up, he would come in on his day off and start bagging groceries. While Val's was owned by Jerry, Mario, then 19 years old, the youngest of Jerry's 4 children, was planning to take over the family business. He was a stock boy like Brian and said Brian was his right-hand man, explaining he was a good worker and made the place run. Fridays were paydays at Val's Foods, and every employee stopped by to pick up their check. Brian was no exception. On December 20th, 2002, he left his home between 4 and 4:30 p.m. to pick up his paycheck. Brian appeared to be in good spirits when he picked up his paycheck and was even more excited to see a cash bonus in an envelope for him. He cashed his $150 paycheck, bought pizza, and told the cashier he was planning to rent some movies. He returned home with pizza and soda. Brian was scheduled to work the evening of December 20th, and though he asked a coworker to switch hours with him that night, he was turned down. And so, Brian left his home a second time between 6:30 and 7 p.m. and headed across the street to Val's, where he worked his shift as a stalker. He was seen by multiple employees at Val's at various times that evening, though he was never seen leaving the store and was not there when it closed around 8 p.m. that night. Brian's mother, Terry, grew concerned when Brian didn't come home following his shift, but she assumed he had gone to someone's house and didn't call. The next morning, his parents noticed his absence at home, but assumed Brian was at work. Meanwhile, an employee, Pablo, at Val's Foods, discovered a pool of about half a liter of watery blood in the produce cooler, noting it looked like a fight had taken place. Pablo asked a fellow coworker, Rob Render, what happened, since Rob was working the night before. Rob said he didn't know what happened. The manager was looped into the blood, but he thought it was meat drippings and had Rob clean it up. While Rob was mopping up the mess, Pablo said a knife was missing from the produce area. Brian's older brother, Eddie, was working at Val's that day and was shocked when Brian didn't show up for his shift. Eddie immediately told his mom about Brian's absence, who then reported Brian missing to police at 2:45 p.m. It was only after Brian was reported missing that anyone realized the significance of the blood found in the cooler. Additional drops of blood were located both inside and outside the cooler, on several produce boxes throughout the store, and on some boxes in the trash compactor. The areas where the blood was found were in areas only frequented by employees. More specifically, only stock employees went into the cooler. Police were able to get traces of blood from the mopped area, and DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Brian. 14 employees were working the night of December 20th, including a manager, 3 cashiers, 4 stock boys, 5 deli workers, and 1 employee in the meat department. Among the employees on shift were Brian's brother Eddie, Rob Render, and Mario Caserio. One of the employees on shift said he walked through the area containing blood around 7 p.m. that night, but did not see any blood, although there was water on the floor. He also testified that he wasn't paying much attention, so perhaps he overlooked the blood. As authorities combed through the store looking for clues, they found signs of a violent struggle. Among the spattered blood was a legible fingerprint. Among Brian's blood, they also found blood evidence belonging to Mario and Rob. Rob initially gave a statement implicating Mario in the murder, but later retracted it. The once tight-knit community of Johnsburg, Illinois, was beginning to turn on one another. Mario sought to place blame on Rob, telling detectives that Rob and Brian didn't get along, that Rob owed Brian money, and Brian caught Rob selling shots of alcohol at a party, alcohol which Brian believed Rob stole from Val's. Mario explained he and Brian were actively working to catch Rob in the act of stealing alcohol from the store. Rob was then interviewed by police and in turn pointed the finger back at Mario. Rob believed Brian was selling drugs and assumed he owed someone money. As far as Rob knew, Brian was getting his supply from Mario. In June of 2007, authorities announced a major breakthrough in the case when they charged Mario with perjury in connection with his grand jury testimony about Brian's disappearance. Prosecutors said he lied to the grand jury when he denied having told a friend that he knew how Brian was killed and how his body was concealed. In August 2008, Rob was charged with concealing Brian's homicide, but the charge was later dropped. Despite this, Mario's attorney sought to cast blame on Rob. Then, during Mario's trial in August 2009, his friend Alan Lippert testified that Mario had told him Brian owed him drug money and that Mario had his friend Shane Lamb scare him, but things quickly got out of hand. Mario further told Alan that his relatives helped him dispose of the body, which was initially buried but later dug up, dismembered, and thrown into a river in Iowa. Alan admitted he had been drinking heavily on the night Mario supposedly confessed the crime to him. He didn't tell police about the conversation until after he was arrested for driving under the influence, but stated he came forward out of conscience. While Mario was on trial for perjury, the presiding judge tossed the charges out, ruling that the prosecution had failed to prove its case. Then, in 2010, Shane, who worked alongside Brian and Mario as a stockboy at Val's, was facing 12 years in prison on cocaine charges. He was a 5-time felon with a record that included attempted murder when he was just 14 years old. Despite denying knowing anything for years about Brian's disappearance, Shane told prosecutors he was ready to make a deal. After being given immunity from any charges related to Brian's death and a reduced sentence on the cocaine conviction, Shane told authorities Mario was behind it all. On December 20th, 2002, Mario asked Shane to, quote, be the muscle, so Mario could get the $500 that Brian owed him. That evening, when Shane arrived at the store, Mario pointed him in Brian's direction, the produce section. Shane claims he confronted Brian, yelling, "What's up with the money you owe him? Why don't you pay him, at least some of the money back?" When they became too loud, Mario told them to go inside the produce cooler, where the three continued to argue. While inside the Val's Foods produce cooler, Shane struck Brian in the head, knocking him unconscious. Uncertain if Brian was dead or alive, Mario told him to leave and that he would handle it. Shane never saw Brian again and said he didn't realize he was dead until after. Shane, who weighed over 100 pounds more than Brian, admitted he had a long criminal history and a history of violent assaults against others. He estimated he had beaten 50 people in his lifetime, but stated he never intended to cause Brian's death. On February 25, 2010, just months after being acquitted of perjury, Mario was arrested and charged with first-degree murder with intimidation and unlawful restraint in the death of Brian, as authorities believed Mario, Shane, and possibly others were involved in the homicide and cover-up. During Mario's trial, several people testified to purchasing weed from Brian. On December 20th, 2002, one of Brian's friends, Amber, went to his house after school to buy a bag of pot. Amber was just one of dozens who could have been called to testify that Brian sold drugs. It was common knowledge at school that Brian was dealing. Brian's own brother, Eddie, testified that he knew Brian sold and knew his supplier was Mario. Eddie explained that he previously sold weed for Mario as well. Mario would provide his dealers with the weed, and the dealers would be expected to pay Mario back after they sold their supply. The problem with this is that Brian was known to give people weed for free with the promise that they would pay later, cutting into Mario's profit. One of Eddie's friends testified that Brian often gave him weed with the promise he would pay him back because Brian knew him and trusted him. At the time of Brian's disappearance, the friend owed Brian money. Testimony also provided information that Shane was Mario's right-hand man, his muscle. Mario made it known to his guys that if they needed help enforcing debts, they could use Shane. There was some evidence that Brian intended to use Shane for that purpose. 2 weeks before he disappeared, a coworker overheard Brian have a conversation with Shane about owed money. He heard Brian telling Shane that 6 or 7 people owed him money, all in the amounts of $30. Brian asked for Shane's help in collecting the money. Shane testified that he would never hit Brian and that he looked out for the kid. Shane explained the most he ever got from Mario at a time was a quarter pound of weed, which was worth $400. Brian and his family had money, so it was never an issue for Mario to collect his money. He said Mario never directed him to harm Brian. The defense argued that Shane didn't want to implicate himself and indicated his testimony shouldn't be believed. The jury was unable to reach a verdict. They deadlocked at 11-1 in favor of convicting Mario of murder. The prosecution announced that they would retry the case. Before they could, in June 2012, one of the witnesses, Rob Render, died of a drug overdose in a halfway house. The prosecution stated they didn't think Rob's death would affect the upcoming retrial, as he had an extensive criminal history and his story about Brian's disappearance had changed many times. So the prosecution didn't think he'd be a credible witness anyway. Any secrets Rob knew about the night Brian disappeared were taken to the grave with him. Mario was retried in 2013 and convicted of murder in November of that year. In September 2015, a court of appeal overturned his conviction and also ruled that the prosecution could not try Mario again. The appeals court said there was insufficient evidence to convict and serious flaws in the prosecution's case, including the fact that Lamb was given full immunity. Mario had been released from prison and now works as an attorney. Brian's family has long believed he was murdered, and they have held a memorial ceremony for him. Brian's mother passed away in 2009, but the rest of the family is still alive and hopes for a resolution in his disappearance. Foul play is suspected in his case due to the circumstances involved. Thank you for listening to Without a Trace with your host, Jill Lynn. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Brian's disappearance. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and follow the podcast on social media. Join me next week as I dive into another case.